The year is 1883. The Montana wind, sharp as a whetted blade, whipped across the open plains, carrying the scent of dry sagebrush and distant cattle. Eleanor Vance, her hands chapped and knuckles raw from a life of hard work, stood on the porch of her small ranch house. She was a woman in her early 30s, her face etched with the early lines of sorrow and resilience. Just 2 weeks ago, she had buried her husband, Thomas. He had been a good man, steady and kind, but a rustling incident had taken him, leaving her with a meager herd, a failing well, and 3 small boys to raise alone. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger, and Eleanor's stomach tightened. She knew that rider, Jasper Thorne, the man who owned the vast expanse of land that bordered hers, a man whose word was law in this unforgiving territory. Thorne was a mountain of a man, his face a craggy landscape of hard living and harder decisions. He was notorious for his lack of mercy and a cold pragmatism that saw humans as little more than assets or liabilities. Eleanor watched him approach, his black duster billowing behind him, a grim silhouette against the setting sun. He dismounted with a single, fluid motion, the creak of his leather saddle a familiar sound of dominance. He didn't bother with a polite greeting. "Eleanor," he stated, his voice a low rumble, "your husband's debt. It's due." Eleanor's heart sank. She knew about the small loan Thomas had taken for new fencing materials. She had hoped to repay it by the end of the year, after the next calving season. "Jasper, please, I just buried Thomas. Give me some time. The cattle won't last you the winter, Eleanor," he cut in, his eyes the color of a winter sky holding no warmth. "Your well is failing. Your fences are in disrepair. Your boys, they're too young to be of any use. You're a widow, a liability." The word hit her like a physical blow. Liability. It was a cruel assessment, a dismissal of her grief and her strength. "I'll manage," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "I'll make it work. Just a few more months." Thorne scoffed, a harsh, humorless sound. "A few more months of what? Watching your children starve? This land is worth more to me than your false hope. You have 2 days. Take what you can carry and be gone. I'll take the house, the land, and what's left of your herd as payment." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, hot and stinging. "You can't do this, Jasper. This is my home. This is where Thomas and I built our lives, where my children were born. Your home is now my collateral," he replied, his tone final. "You have until sunset on the 2nd day. Don't make me come back here." He turned and mounted his horse, a cold, unyielding shadow, disappearing back into the twilight. Eleanor stood on the porch long after he was gone, the silence of the plains filled with the echoes of his words. She felt a profound sense of helplessness, a tidal wave of despair threatening to drown her. How could she protect her children now? Caleb, just 7, was her rock, always trying to be the man of the house. Ethan, 6, was quiet and observant, his eyes too old for his years, and little Jonas, only 5, was a beacon of pure innocence. How could she tell them they had no home? Later that evening, after the boys were asleep in their small beds, their breath soft and rhythmic, Eleanor sat by the cold hearth, a single lantern her only company. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and desperation. She had no one to turn to. Neighbors were either too far away or too scared of Thorne's influence to offer help. The one man she had always considered a friend, Old Man Bear, lived miles away and was often gone for weeks at a time on hunting and trapping expeditions. As the first light of dawn painted the sky, a horse's whinny broke the oppressive silence. Eleanor rushed outside, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. A lone rider approached, but it wasn't Jasper Thorne. It was Old Man Bear, his weathered face creased in a frown of concern. He was a crow man, his features a roadmap of a hard life spent under the sun. He dismounted, his movements deliberate and calm. "I heard," he said simply, his voice a gravelly whisper. The wind carries cruel words, Eleanor. She didn't need to say anything. He saw the truth in her tear-stained face, the exhaustion in her posture. He gave me 2 days, Bear. 2 days to leave everything behind. Old Man Bear's gaze softened, a deep, ancient wisdom reflected in his eyes. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false promises. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of profound empathy. A man who builds his kingdom on the suffering of others, it will not last. A house built on sand will fall. "But where do we go?" she asked, the words a raw, guttural cry. "I have no money, no home. I can't take the boys on the road." Old Man Bear looked out across the barren landscape, his eyes scanning the horizon. "There is a place," he said, pointing a gnarled finger toward the eastern edge of Thorn's property, a neglected, scrub-filled patch of land. "An old barn. Thorn uses it for nothing. He calls it the Scar on the Land, and it is on the edge of the creek. A good place, not a home, but a shelter. We will make it a home." Eleanor looked at the old barn, a broken-down husk of wood and tin, and her heart ached with the reality of it. It was a step down, a symbol of their complete and utter loss. But in Old Man Bear's eyes, she saw not pity, but a promise of a new beginning, however humble, a promise that they would not be broken. With a renewed sense of purpose, she went back inside to wake her boys, the first light of a new, uncertain day dawning upon them. They had lost their home, but they had not lost their spirit. Not yet. The journey to the old barn was a somber one, measured in the silent steps of their single, tired horse, pulling a makeshift cart loaded with their meager possessions. Caleb, Ethan, and Jonas sat huddled together, their small faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Eleanor, walking alongside the cart, kept her gaze fixed on the path ahead, her expression a mask of grim determination. She didn't want the boys to see her cry. They were leaving behind everything they had ever known, the scent of their father's pipe tobacco in the air, the creak of the floorboards in their home, the familiar shapes of the trees that marked their property line. It was all gone, swallowed by Jasper Thorne's greed. The barn stood alone in a field of tall, whispering grass, a derelict monument to a forgotten time. It was a skeletal structure, the roof riddled with holes, one of the main doors hanging off its hinges, and the air inside smelling of dust, decay, and old hay. Eleanor stepped inside, the dim light filtering through the gaps in the walls. It was a shelter, but a fragile one. The boys looked around, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Is this our new home, Mama?" Caleb asked, his voice a small, wavering sound. Eleanor knelt, pulling her boys into a tight embrace. "For now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a place where we will be safe, a place where we will start over. We will fix it. Little by little, we will make it ours." Old Man Bear, a quiet observer, began to unload their things. He worked with a calm efficiency, his hands calloused and strong, handling their few belongings with a gentle reverence. He helped Eleanor rig a canvas sheet over the largest hole in the roof to keep out the rain. He found a broken-down wagon wheel and patched it up, using it to create a makeshift table. He even managed to fashion a small fire pit from loose stones, a place for them to cook their meals and find a sliver of warmth on the cool Montana nights. The first few weeks were a brutal lesson in survival. They lived on what little they had, the flour, the beans, and the salted meat they had managed to salvage. Eleanor taught the boys how to set snares for rabbits and how to find edible plants. Caleb, despite his age, took to the role of protector, his small chest puffing out with pride as he brought back a hare he had caught. Ethan, ever the observer, learned to mend fences and help Old Man Bear tend to their one remaining horse. Jonas, the youngest, found solace in the wild world around them, collecting smooth riverstones and finding wonder in the flight of a hawk. Old Man Bear became their silent guardian, their teacher. He taught them the ways of the land, sharing the ancient knowledge of his people. He showed them how to read the clouds to predict a storm, how to track a deer by its hoofprints, and how to find water where there seemed to be none. He wasn't a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. He would bring them fresh fish he had caught in the creek or a wild turkey he had hunted. He was a bridge between their past and their uncertain future, a link to a world that was both wild and beautiful. One afternoon, a wagon pulled up to the barn. Eleanor's heart pounded. It was Mrs. Gable, the wife of the town's general store owner, a kind, stout woman with a penchant for gossip and a heart of gold. She got out of the wagon, her face a mix of sympathy and curiosity. "Eleanor," she said, her voice hushed, "we heard what Jasper Thorne did. The town is talking." Eleanor's face tightened. "Let them talk. We're getting by." "We brought some things," Mrs. Gable said, looking past Eleanor at the boys playing in the field. "Some flour, sugar, some quilts. It's not much, but—" Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. You have no idea what this means." "Mrs." Gable nodded, her eyes lingering on the broken-down barn. "He's a cruel man, Eleanor, but you're a strong woman. Your boys are lucky to have you." Her words were a much-needed balm for Eleanor's weary soul. They were a reminder that they were not alone, that kindness still existed in the world. As the weeks turned into months, the barn slowly began to transform. The boys, under the patient guidance of Old Man Bear, learned to work with their hands. They mended the roof, patched the walls with mud and straw, and built a small, crude pen for the horse. It was far from a comfortable home, but it was theirs, built from their own sweat and determination. One evening, as they sat around the small fire, the boys listening intently to Old Man Bear's stories of his youth, Eleanor looked at her sons. They were no longer the frightened boys who had been forced from their home. They were growing up, their faces smudged with dirt, but their eyes bright with a new kind of resilience. They were learning to stand on their own 2 feet, to survive, to thrive even in the most difficult of circumstances. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would never be broken. Jasper Thorne had taken her home, but he had given her something more valuable, a chance to raise her boys into men of strength, character, and honor. He had tried to break her, but all he had done was make them stronger. Years blurred into a decade and a half. The boys were no longer boys. Caleb was now 22, a lean, sinewy man with his father's steady gaze and his mother's iron will. He had an innate sense of direction and a natural affinity for tracking, skills he had honed under Old Man Bear's tutelage. He was a man of few words, his actions speaking for him. Ethan, 21, was broad-shouldered and quiet, his hands strong and capable. He had a way with animals, a gift for understanding the silent language of horses that was almost mystical. He was the family's rock, steady and reliable. Jonas, 20, was the youngest, but his mind was the sharpest. He was a natural tinkerer, a problem solver who could fix anything from a broken wagon wheel to a finicky rifle. He was the thinker, the strategist. They had transformed the old barn into a respectable homestead. The holes in the roof were patched with new wood, the walls were sturdy, and a small vegetable garden flourished on the side. The land, once barren, now had a new well they had dug themselves and a modest corral for the horses they had acquired. Eleanor, now a woman in her late 40s, had a quiet dignity about her. She was a pillar of the community, known for her delicious baked goods and a quiet, unshakable strength that commanded respect. One day, Old Man Bear, now in his late 60s, did not return from his usual hunting trip. A day turned into 2, then 3. The boys grew concerned. Old Man Bear was a man of habit. He never stayed away longer than a week without sending a message. Caleb, a knot of unease in his gut, decided to go looking for him. He took his horse and set out, following the familiar tracks of the old man. He rode for hours, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign. He found the old man's camp, the fire pit cold, the belongings untouched. It was a strange sight. Old Man Bear was a meticulous man. He wouldn't leave his camp so carelessly. A few yards away, near a small stream, Caleb found a piece of torn cloth. It was a piece of Old Man Bear's jacket. A few more yards, near a cluster of rocks, he found a bloodied piece of fabric, a dark stain against the grey stone. His heart hammered in his chest. This was not a hunting trip gone wrong. This was something else. He continued his search, his tracker's instincts on high alert. He followed the signs, subtle and almost invisible to an untrained eye. A broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss, a scuff mark in the dirt. The trail led him not into the wilderness, but back towards Thorn's land. A chill ran down his spine. The path of the old man's horse ended abruptly, replaced by the deep, deliberate imprints of two horses. The tracks were fresh, no more than 2 or 3 days old. The riders were headed in a direct line towards Jasper Thorn's ranch. Caleb returned to the barn, his face a grim mask. He dismounted, and Ethan and Jonas were there, their faces etched with worry. "He's not lost," Caleb said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "He's been taken. The trail ends on Thorn's land." 2 men. They didn't even try to hide the tracks. Eleanor's face paled. "Thorn," she whispered. The name, a source of old fear and resentment, hung in the air like a shroud. "Why would he take Old Man Bear?" Ethan asked, his voice low and dangerous. Old Man Bear was more than a mentor. He was family. He was the man who had given them a home when they had none. "I don't know," Caleb said, his eyes hard as flint. "But we're going to find out." That night, the 3 brothers sat around the fire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. The jovial atmosphere of their usual evenings was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. This was not just a search, it was a mission. They were no longer boys raised in a barn. They were men, forged in the fires of hardship and loss. "We can't just ride in there," Jonas said, his mind already working, analyzing the possibilities. "Thorn's ranch is a fortress. He has guards, men who will shoot first and ask questions later." "Then we won't go through the front gate," Caleb replied, his gaze fixed on the distance. "I know the land better than anyone. Bear taught me. There's a ravine on the north side of the property, a blind spot in Thorn's patrols." Ethan nodded, his hands clenching into fists. "Whatever it takes," he said, his voice flat with resolve. Eleanor watched them, her heart a mix of pride and fear. These were her sons, the boys who had learned to survive in a dilapidated barn. They were going to face the man who had taken everything from them once before. She knew she couldn't stop them, and she wouldn't. This was their fight. A fight not just for Old Man Bear, but for their dignity, their past, and their future. The next morning they prepared for their journey. They packed what they would need: extra ammunition, food, water. As they mounted their horses, Eleanor came out of the barn, her eyes filled with a mother's worry. "Be careful," she said, her voice a plea. "He's a dangerous man." "We know, Ma," Caleb said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll be back, with Bear." He met her gaze, and she saw in his eyes not the frightened boy she had rescued from the cold 15 years ago, but a man who was ready to face the ghosts of his past. The 3 brothers rode out, a trio of hardened men on a mission of rescue and vengeance. The dust rose behind them, a silent cloud of determination, as they headed toward the lion's den. The Thorn Ranch was a testament to one man's relentless ambition. The sprawling estate, located on a hill overlooking the valley, was fortified with high fences and patrolled by a small army of armed guards. The main house, a grand structure of stone and timber, stood like a fortress against the elements. As the brothers approached, they felt the oppressive weight of Thorn's power, a force that had driven them from their home and now held their mentor captive. Caleb led them through a thick forest, a route known only to him and Old Man Bear. They rode in a single file, the only sound the rhythmic thud of their horses' hooves on the soft earth. He was a ghost in the woods, his body and mind attuned to every sound, every movement. He knew the land, the lay of the ravines, the blind spots in Thorn's patrols. Jonas, ever the strategist, kept a running mental map of their position, calculating their distance from the main house and the guard outposts. Ethan, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle, was a silent sentinel, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of trouble. They dismounted near a rocky outcrop that overlooked the ranch. From their vantage point they could see the whole compound, the bunkhouses, the corrals, the vast fields of cattle. A single, solitary figure was being led from the main house to a small, isolated cabin at the far end of the property. The figure was stooped, his movements slow and pained. Even from a distance they knew who it was. Old Man Bear. "They're keeping him isolated," Jonas whispered, his eyes narrowed. "That means he's a secret. Thorn doesn't want anyone to know he's here." "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice a low growl. "What does he want with Bear?" Caleb's gaze was fixed on the cabin. "We'll find out. We go in at nightfall. It's the only time we'll have a chance. We'll split up. Jonas, you create a diversion on the far side of the ranch, near the cattle pens. It'll draw a few of the guards away from the main house. Ethan, you'll be our overwatch. Keep a bead on that cabin. If anyone comes near, you let me know." "And you?" Jonas asked. "I go for Bear," Caleb said simply. "I'll be a shadow in the night." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and purple, the brothers prepared to put their plan into action. Jonas made his way silently through the fields, his body a low silhouette against the darkening landscape. He reached the cattle pens, and with a few well-placed stones, created a stampede. The sound of hooves thundering across the field, the panicked cries of the cattle, was the perfect distraction. He heard the shouts of the guards and watched as a few of them hurried to contain the chaos. Meanwhile, Caleb moved like a phantom, his movements as fluid and silent as a hunting wolf. He bypassed the main patrol route, using the ravines and the tall grass as his cover. He saw the guards, their rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces illuminated by the dim light of their lanterns. He was a ghost, a whisper, a shadow that moved unseen. He reached the cabin, a small dark structure set apart from the rest of the ranch. He peered through the single grimy window. Inside, Old Man Bear sat on a makeshift cot, his face bruised and his hands bound. A large, menacing-looking man with a scarred face stood over him, his voice low and threatening. "Tell me where it is, old man! Where did he hide it?" Caleb's blood ran cold. What was Thorn looking for? He knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that this wasn't about vengeance. It was about something hidden, something valuable. He waited for the guard to leave. He watched as the man, frustrated, slammed the door and walked away, his heavy footsteps fading into the night. Caleb moved to the door, his hand on the rusty latch. He had to be careful. The old wood could creak, the lock could be noisy. He worked with a surgeon's precision, using a small piece of wire he had salvaged to pry the lock open. The door swung inward with a soft groan. Caleb slipped inside, the moonlight illuminating the small, bare room. Old Man Bear looked up, his eyes widening in a mixture of surprise and relief. "Caleb," he whispered, his voice raspy, "you should not be here." "We're a family, Bear," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. "We don't leave family behind." He quickly cut the bindings on the old man's wrists. Old Man Bear winced, his wrists raw and chafed. "What were they looking for?" Caleb asked, his voice urgent. "What did they want from you?" "A map," Bear whispered, his voice still weak. "Thomas. He found something. A mine, a rich one. He made a map, and he trusted me with it. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I was to give it to Eleanor." Caleb's mind reeled. A mine, a rich one. His father had never mentioned a thing. It explained everything. Thorn's ruthless pursuit of their land, his refusal to show mercy. It wasn't just about debt. It was about greed. His father had died protecting a secret that could have saved his family, but in his final moments he had trusted a friend to keep it safe. "We have to go," Caleb said, his hand on the old man's shoulder. "No," Bear said, a sudden urgency in his voice. "I am too weak. You must go. The map is hidden in a place only I know. It's a risk to take me. Go, Caleb. Take this." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden figure. "This is not the map, but it will lead you to it, and it will prove who is a man of honor and who is not." Caleb's mind was racing. He knew the old man was right. Taking a weakened man on horseback would be too slow, too dangerous. He squeezed Old Man Bear's shoulder. "We'll be back for you, Bear. I swear it." As the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, Caleb slipped out of the cabin, disappearing back into the shadows. He had what he came for, not the man himself, but the truth. And with that truth, he had a new mission. He had a map, and he knew where it was. Caleb returned to his brothers, his face a grim mask. He quickly relayed what he had learned. The map, the mine, Thorn's insatiable greed. The information hung in the air, a dark cloud of betrayal and injustice. Their father, a man they had believed to be a simple rancher, had been sitting on a secret that could have changed their lives, and he had entrusted it to the one man who had been a true friend to their family. "So he wasn't just cruel," Jonas said, his voice laced with a cold fury. "He knew what our father had. He just wanted it all for himself." "It makes sense," Ethan said, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. "He wasn't after a small debt. He was after a fortune." Caleb held up the small wooden figure Old Man Bear had given him. "This isn't the map itself," he explained, "but it's a key. Bear said it will lead us to it, and it will prove who is a man of honor." The brothers knew what they had to do. They couldn't just ride out, not with Old Man Bear still a prisoner. They had a new plan, one that was far more dangerous than their initial rescue mission. This time, they would go to the heart of the problem. They would ride into town and confront Jasper Thorne directly, not with guns blazing, but with the truth. They spent the rest of the night planning. Jonas, with his sharp mind, laid out the details. They would ride into town at dawn, a time when most people were just beginning their day. They would make a public spectacle of it, a confrontation in the middle of Main Street, where Thorne's power was at its peak. "He won't hurt us in public," Jonas reasoned, "not with a whole town watching. He has a reputation to protect. He can't just gun down a man and his brothers in broad daylight." "He'll try to find a way around it," Caleb said, his eyes narrowed in thought. "He'll lie. He'll deny everything." "That's where the wooden figure comes in," Ethan added. "Bear said it would prove who is a man of honor. It's not a weapon, it's a testimony." As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the empty streets of the small town of Redemption Gulch, the three brothers rode in. They were not dressed in their usual ranch gear. They were wearing their best clothes, a sign of respect and a silent declaration of their purpose. They rode with a quiet dignity, their backs straight, their eyes fixed on the entrance of the Red Dog Saloon, where they knew Thorne conducted most of his business. Jasper Thorne was just stepping out of the saloon, a cigar in his hand, a sneer on his face. He saw them, and his cold eyes narrowed in recognition. He hadn't seen them since they were boys. Now they were men, hardened and formidable. For a moment, a flicker of something that looked like surprise, or perhaps fear, crossed his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look what the wind blew in. The Vance boys, all grown up and still trespassing." Caleb dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He stood in the middle of the street, the sun glinting off the metal buckle of his belt. "We're not here to trespass, Thorne," he said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the angry boy of 15 years ago. "We're here for the truth," Thorne scoffed, a cloud of smoke escaping his lips. "What truth? You're a man of the streets, boy. You wouldn't know the truth if it bit you." "The truth about my father's land," Caleb said, his voice gaining volume. "The truth about what you were really after. It wasn't a debt, was it? It was a mine." A hush fell over the street. The few people who were out and about stopped to listen. Thorne's face went white, his mask of indifference cracking. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "You're delusional, boy." "We have proof," Ethan said, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "We have a witness," Jonas added. Thorn's eyes flickered from one brother to the next, a glint of fear in their depths. He knew they were telling the truth. He knew they had found out. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice now a desperate plea. "Am I?" Caleb said, holding up the wooden figure. "Do you know what this is? Do you know who gave it to us?" Thorn's eyes widened. He recognized the figure. He knew who had made it. His mind for a moment was a whirlwind of memories, a conversation with Thomas Vance, a promise he had made, a secret he had kept. He knew he was beaten. He was cornered. Suddenly a guard, a loyal dog to Thorn's will, stepped out from behind a wagon, his rifle raised. "Drop your guns, boys, now!" The moment was a powder keg, ready to explode. The townspeople gasped, their faces a mix of horror and morbid fascination. Thorn's gamble had backfired. He had tried to silence them, but all he had done was expose his true colors. "Tell him to drop his gun, Thorn," Caleb said, his voice a command. "Tell him, or the whole town will know what you are." Jasper Thorn looked from the guard to the three brothers, their faces a sea of unyielding resolve. He looked at the townspeople, their eyes filled with suspicion and judgment. He knew in that moment that he had lost. He had underestimated them. He had thought they were just boys, but they were men, men who had come back to reclaim their legacy. And in that moment, Jasper Thorn froze, his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. The silence that followed Caleb's command was thick with tension, a palpable pressure that held the entire street in a state of suspended animation. The guard, his rifle still aimed at the brothers, looked to Jasper Thorn for a command. Thorn, however, was a statue of defeat. He had lost control of the narrative, and the truth, like a wildfire, was beginning to spread. The townspeople who had long feared his power were now watching, their expressions a mix of fear and dawning comprehension. They were seeing a man who was once a titan of the territory, now reduced to a cornered animal. "Drop it, Frank," Thorn said, his voice a low, defeated whisper. "Drop the damn gun." The guard, confused, hesitated for a moment before lowering his rifle. The moment passed, and the tension in the air dissipated, replaced by a sense of stunned realization. The brothers had won the first battle, not with bullets, but with honor and a well-placed truth. Caleb walked a few paces closer to Thorn, his eyes fixed on the rancher. "You have a choice, Thorn," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. "You can continue to lie and lose everything, or you can tell us where you've taken Old Man Bear, and we can settle this like men." Thorn's face, a roadmap of years of cruelty, was now a portrait of a man unraveling. He looked at the three brothers, the boys he had scorned, and saw not the weak children he had left to die, but the strong, formidable men they had become. He saw Caleb, a mirror image of the father he had wronged. He saw Ethan, a quiet force of nature. And he saw Jonas, the mind that had orchestrated his downfall. "He's at the ranch," Thorn said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's in the old barn on the west side. He's not hurt, just a prisoner." He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground. "He wouldn't tell me where it was, the map. He said he would only tell a man of honor." "And you knew you weren't that man," Jonas said, his voice flat with contempt. Thorn didn't respond. He simply nodded, a single, defeated motion. "Now what, boys?" Mrs. Gable's voice cut through the silence. "You gonna take him to the sheriff?" Caleb looked at the rancher, a man who had stripped them of their dignity and their home. He saw no triumph in the rancher's defeat, just a deep, profound sadness. "No," he said, his voice firm. "We're going to get Bear, and then we'll decide what to do with him." Thorn, for the first time in his life, looked at a group of men who were not subservient to him. He was a man who had built his empire on fear, but these men were fearless. They had come not for a fight, but for justice. "I'll give you a horse," Thorn said, his voice a raw, broken thing, "and a wagon for the old man, And, and my men won't bother you. Not on my land. Not ever again." The brothers looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. They had won. They had not only found out where Old Man Bear was, but they had also broken a man who had once been unbreakable. They had done it not with brute force, but with a quiet, unyielding strength that had come from their years of struggle. The next few hours were a whirlwind. The brothers rode to Thorn's ranch, not as trespassers, but as men with a purpose. Thorn, true to his word, had his guards stand down. They found Old Man Bear where Thorn said he would be, bruised and weak, but alive. The old man's face, a map of ancient wisdom and hardship, lit up when he saw the boys. "You came," he said, his voice weak. "We told you we would, Bear," Caleb said, helping him into the wagon. As they rode back to their homestead, the sun was high in the sky, a golden orb of hope. Old Man Bear was in the back of the wagon, his body weak but his spirit unbroken. He looked at the boys, at the men they had become, and a single tear of pride rolled down his cheek. He had given them a home in a broken barn, and they had given him a family. "The map," he whispered, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "It's hidden in the barn, in the floorboards, in the place where we first made our home, where you learned to be men." Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. The map, the secret to their family's future, was not in some far-flung wilderness. It was in the very place where they had found their strength, the place that was a testament to their resilience. It was a poetic end to their journey. The key to their future had been in the past all along, in the very place where they had risen from the ashes. The dust from their wagon wheels painted a beautiful picture against the Montana sky. They were a family, forged in the fires of adversity, and they were finally on their way to a new life, a life built on a foundation of honesty and honor. The rancher who had scorned them was now a broken man, a cautionary tale of greed. And they, the boys who had been raised in a barn, were now men who had reclaimed their legacy. The return to the barn felt different this time. It was no longer a symbol of their past hardship, but a testament to their resilience and the truth that lay hidden within its weathered walls. Eleanor was waiting for them, her face a mixture of relief and worry. When she saw Old Man Bear in the back of the wagon, she rushed to him, her hands trembling as she helped him down. She didn't ask questions. She saw the answers in the boys' faces and in the old man's exhausted but peaceful expression. That evening, with the sun setting and casting long shadows across the valley, the family gathered inside the barn. The air was thick with anticipation. Old Man Bear, now resting on a cot, gestured toward the floorboards. "There," he said, his voice raspy, "under the third beam from the west wall, the one that was loose when we first came here." Caleb knelt, his hands working at the old wood. He remembered the loose board. He and Ethan had spent hours trying to secure it when they were boys, their small hands fumbling with rusty nails. Now his strong hands easily pried the board free. Beneath it, nestled in a small, hollowed-out space, was a small, worn leather pouch. He pulled it out and untied the string. Inside was a piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age. It was a hand-drawn map. It was crude, but the markings were clear. A winding creek, a prominent rock formation, and a large weathered X near a cluster of old pine trees. At the bottom, in his father's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Eleanor, for the boys, for our future." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had known her husband was a dreamer, but a miner, a man with a secret fortune. It was a part of him she had never known. The weight of the parchment in Caleb's hands was a heavy one. It wasn't just a map, it was a key to their family's future, a future that had been stolen from them 15 years ago. "The mine," Jonas whispered, his eyes wide. "He didn't just find a little bit of gold. This looks like a large vein." "This explains everything," Ethan said, a slow, cold anger brewing in his eyes. "Thorn wasn't just greedy, he was a thief. He took our home, he took our security, and he almost took our lives. All for this. We can't just take it," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "We have to do something. This belongs to us, but it's a testament to his cruelty." "What do we do, Ma?" Caleb asked, his gaze fixed on the map. "We use it as a tool," she said, her voice a calm, strategic force. "We don't take it all, we don't become like him. We use it to build something better, a town of our own, built on honesty and respect. A place where a man's word is his bond and a woman's strength is her own." The idea was a revelation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. They would not become like the man who had wronged them. They would use their fortune to build a legacy of good, a legacy their father would be proud of. The next day, they rode to the mine, their hearts filled with a sense of purpose. It was exactly as the map described. A small, unassuming cave hidden behind a rock formation. The ground was rich with quartz veins, glittering with the promise of gold. It wasn't a trick. It was real. They spent the next few days working in silence, their movements methodical and their purpose clear. They extracted a small amount of gold, just enough to show the assay office in the nearby town of Redemption Gulch. The assayer, a stout, jovial man named Mr. Patterson, looked at the nugget and his eyes widened in surprise. "Where did you find this, boys?" he asked, his voice a low, excited whisper. "This is high grade, very high grade." Caleb simply smiled. "We found it on our land," he said, his voice firm. "We're not here to sell it. We're here to register the claim. We want to do this the right way." Mr. Patterson, a man who had seen his share of shady dealings, looked at the three brothers and saw a stark contrast to the greed and corruption that plagued the West. He saw honesty. He saw honor. The news of the Vance family's discovery spread like wildfire through the town. The quiet, humble family, who had been scorned by Jasper Thorne, had found a fortune. The rumor mill was in overdrive. People were amazed, inspired. The story of a mother who had raised her boys in a barn, only to see them return as men of honor, was a tale that resonated deeply with the spirit of the West. Jasper Thorne, now a broken man, heard the news. He saw the truth for what it was. He had lost. Not because of a powerful adversary, but because of his own greed. He had tried to steal what was not his, and in doing so he had lost his dignity, his reputation, and his power. The boys, who had been raised in a barn, had taught him a lesson he would never forget. News of the Vance family's discovery and their subsequent confrontation with Jasper Thorne spread far and wide, becoming a modern-day legend in the territory. The story resonated with the local populace, who had long suffered under the thumb of powerful ranchers and land barons. The Vance family, once a symbol of poverty and misfortune, was now a beacon of hope and resilience. With their newfound wealth, the brothers began to put Eleanor's plan into action. They didn't build a new ranch for themselves. Instead, they bought a large plot of land adjacent to their homestead and began to build a town. They called it Haven. It wasn't just a town. It was a community built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. Jonas, with his engineering mind, was in charge of the layout. He designed the streets to be wide and clean, with a clear drainage system. He oversaw the construction of a new general store, a blacksmith and a schoolhouse. He made sure the new well they dug would be accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford it. Ethan, with his quiet strength, was in charge of the animals and the infrastructure. He built a large, modern stable for the horses and a corral for the livestock. He helped the new ranchers who began to flock to Haven with their own herds, offering them advice and a helping hand. His calm demeanor and natural affinity for animals earned him the respect of everyone who knew him. Caleb, with his keen eye and sharp mind, was in charge of security. He organized a small, volunteer-based town watch to ensure the peace was kept and to protect the new families from any lingering threats from Thorne's former men. He was firm but fair, a protector who didn't resort to violence unless absolutely necessary. And Eleanor, the matriarch, was the heart of it all. She organized the women of the town, establishing a community garden and a small infirmary. She taught the children to read and write in the new schoolhouse, and her kitchen was always open for anyone who needed a warm meal or a kind word. She was no longer just the woman who had been scorned. She was the woman who had built a town. Jasper Thorne, in the meantime, was a ghost in his own kingdom. His reputation was in tatters. His men, who had once been loyal to him out of fear, began to leave. The once pristine Thorne Ranch became a symbol of a man's fall from grace. He was now a recluse, a prisoner in his own home, haunted by the past and the knowledge of what he had lost. One day, a young ambitious journalist from Denver named Arthur Finch arrived in Haven. He had heard the stories and was determined to write about the rise of this new, honorable town and the Vance family that had built it. He interviewed Eleanor, the brothers, and the new residents of Haven. He saw the truth for himself, the wide, clean streets, the happy, bustling people, the sense of community that permeated the air. He saw a stark contrast to the greed and lawlessness of other Western towns. He wrote an article titled, "The Rancher Scorned the Woman Who Raised Three in a Barn." It was a piece that captured the spirit of the Vance family's journey, from hardship to redemption. He wrote about the courage of Eleanor, the strength of her sons, and the quiet wisdom of Old Man Bear. The article was a sensation, and people from all over the country began to flock to Haven, seeking a new life in a town built on a foundation of integrity. The climax of their story was not a gunfight, but a silent testament to the power of honor. The three brothers, once dismissed as little more than vagrants, had used their wit, their strength, and their deep-seated family values to reclaim their legacy and build something even greater. They had proven that in the Wild West, a man's true wealth was not measured in gold, but in the respect and dignity he commanded. The years passed, and Haven grew into a thriving, prosperous town. It was a model of order and community, a stark contrast to the lawlessness of the surrounding territories. The Vance brothers, now in their 30s, were respected leaders, their past a well-known legend that served as a moral compass for the town. Eleanor, now a woman with silver in her hair, was the revered matriarch, her wisdom and kindness a source of comfort for all who knew her. Jasper Thorne, on the other hand, was a forgotten man. His ranch, once a symbol of power, was now a dilapidated ruin. His herds had dwindled, his men had left, and he lived in isolation, a lonely figure haunted by his past. His defeat was not a dramatic, bloody one, but a slow, agonizing slide into irrelevance. One cold winter afternoon, as snow fell softly on the streets of Haven, a young boy from a neighboring ranch came to the Vance homestead. He was trembling, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a shaky whisper, "my pa says, he says Jasper Thorne's out of his mind. He's been living in the bunkhouse, and he's not eaten in days. He says he wants to talk to you, alone." Caleb's eyes met his brother's. They all knew this moment was coming, the reckoning. He was the one who had to go. This was his final act of closure. He mounted his horse, his heart a mixture of trepidation and resolution. He rode toward the Thorne Ranch, the familiar path now a symbol of his journey, from a scorned boy to a man of honor. He found Thorne in the bunkhouse, a dirty, unkempt place that smelled of decay and despair. Thorne was a shell of the man he once was, his clothes ragged, his eyes hollow. He looked up when Caleb entered, and for a moment he saw the face of the man he had wronged. He saw Thomas Vance, and a shiver ran down his spine. "I came," Caleb said simply, his voice low and steady. "What do you want?" Thorne's hands were shaking as he held a small, crumpled piece of paper. I just wanted you to know," he stammered, his voice a dry, rasping sound, "that I knew all along. He told me, Thomas, he told me he found a mine, and he trusted me. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to make sure you got the map, and I took it." Caleb's heart sank. His father, in his final act, had trusted Jasper Thorne, the one man who would betray him. The betrayal was not just a matter of greed, it was a personal one. "Why?" Caleb asked, his voice filled with a profound sadness. "I don't know," Thorne whispered, his eyes filled with a tortured anguish. "I saw your mother, and she was weak, a woman alone. And I saw the land, and I saw a chance, and I got greedy. I took it all, and I was a coward. I didn't want to get my hands dirty. I was a fool." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. "This is the original map," he said, his hand trembling. "The one your father gave me. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe. I knew one day you would come for it. Maybe. I just needed to see what would happen." Caleb took the notebook. It was a testament to his father's trust and Thorne's betrayal. He looked at the man who had caused his family so much pain, and he felt no anger, just a deep, profound sense of pity. Thorne was not a monster. He was just a broken man who had succumbed to greed. "I can't forgive you," Caleb said, his voice a low, final whisper. "Not for what you did to my mother, not for what you did to my father. But I won't let you starve. I'll send you a blanket and some food. But that's all. You're alone now, just as you left us all those years ago." He turned and walked away, leaving Thorne alone with his ghosts. He rode back to Haven, the snow falling around him, a silent cleansing of the past. He had faced his demons, and he had won, not with violence, but with a quiet, unyielding sense of justice. The story of the Vance family was a testament to the idea that a man's character was not defined by his wealth, but by his honor. And they had built a legacy that would last for generations. The years that followed the final confrontation with Jasper Thorne were a time of peace and prosperity for Haven. The town flourished, a testament to the Vance family's integrity and leadership. The brothers, now respected pillars of the community, settled into their roles. Caleb, as the de facto sheriff, maintained order with a quiet authority. Ethan managed the livestock and the stable, his silent competence reassuring everyone. Jonas, the ever-present strategist, oversaw the town's continued development, from the expansion of the school to the construction of a new mill. Eleanor, the heart of it all, watched her sons with immense pride. The boys who had once huddled together for warmth in a dilapidated barn were now men of substance, their lives a living example of honor and resilience. Their homestead, once a humble shelter, was now the grandest house in Haven, a quiet symbol of their journey. But the peace of the small town was about to be shattered. The story of the Vance family and their hidden fortune had spread far beyond the Montana territory. It had reached the ears of men who did not respect honor, men who only understood greed. One such man was Silas Croft, a ruthless land speculator from California, known for his cunning and his lack of a moral compass. He was a man who bought, cheated, and stole his way to wealth, and the story of the Vance mine was a temptation he couldn't resist. Croft was a different kind of villain from Jasper Thorne. Thorne was a product of the rough-and-tumble West, a man whose cruelty was born of a harsh, unforgiving world. Croft, however, was a professional, a polished predator who used legal loopholes and manipulation as his weapons. He arrived in Haven in a finely appointed carriage, a small army of lawyers and hired guns in tow. He was not looking for a fight, he was looking for a claim to the Vance land. The town buzzed with a mix of curiosity and unease. Haven had always been a tight-knit community, and the arrival of a stranger with such a clear agenda was a cause for concern. Croft set up an office in the newly built hotel, a temporary base from which he began his quiet assault on the town. He wasn't subtle. He had his men begin to question the residents about the mine, the original claim, and the circumstances of the Vance family's rise. Caleb knew what was happening. He saw the subtle hints, the whispers, the way Croft's men looked at his family's land with a predatory gleam in their eyes. He met with his brothers in the study of their home, the map of the mine spread out on the table between them. "He's not just a speculator," Caleb said, his voice low and serious. "He's a claim jumper. He's looking for a way to prove our claim is invalid, to take the mine from us and from this town." "He'll never get it," Ethan said, his knuckles white as he clenched his hands into fists. "We'll fight him, legally or otherwise." "He's not Thorn," Jonas said, his eyes scanning the legal documents they had on hand. "He's smart. He'll find a loophole. He won't challenge us with a gun. He'll challenge us in a courtroom." The threat was more insidious than a physical confrontation. It was a threat to their very identity, to the foundation on which Haven was built. They had won against Thorn with a show of honor, but how could honor stand against a barrage of legal filings and underhanded tactics? The days turned into weeks, and Croft's pressure on the town intensified. He began offering high prices for small parcels of land, trying to create a patchwork of ownership that would muddle the Vance claim. He brought in more men, and their presence, a silent threat of violence, hung in the air like a storm cloud. The peace of Haven was eroding, replaced by a sense of foreboding. One evening, as the brothers sat around the fire, a solemn mood hanging over them, Eleanor came in with a pot of coffee. She had a quiet strength about her, a resilience born of a hard life. She sat down, her gaze settling on the worry etched into her sons' faces. "He's trying to do what Thorn couldn't," she said, her voice calm and clear. "He's trying to break us. He's trying to make us doubt ourselves." "We're not broken, Ma," Caleb said, his voice filled with a weary determination. "I know you aren't," she replied, her eyes holding his. "But this is not a fight you can win with a gun or with honor. This is a fight for the soul of this town, and you must not lose sight of what we're fighting for." Her words were a much-needed reminder. They weren't just fighting for a mine, they were fighting for the dream of Haven, for the community they had built with their own hands. The fight was not against a man, but against an ideology of greed and opportunism. The storm was gathering, but the Vance family was not afraid. They had faced worse, and they had emerged stronger. They had a town to protect, a legacy to uphold, and a mother's wisdom to guide them. The real battle was about to begin, and it would be a test of their resolve, their unity, and their unshakable belief in the values that had made them who they were. The legal challenge from Silas Croft came in the form of a meticulously crafted lawsuit, filed in the nearest federal court. The complaint argued that the Vance claim to the mine was invalid, based on a series of obscure legal precedents and a creative interpretation of the original land grant documents. Croft's lawyers were ruthless, their arguments a web of jargon and half-truths designed to confuse and intimidate. The Vance family, with the help of Mr. Patterson, the assayer, and a few other trusted town leaders, sought legal counsel. They hired a young but sharp-minded lawyer from a neighboring town, a man named Jeremiah "Jem" Stone. Jem was a man of principles, a rarity in the world of Western law, and he was deeply moved by the Vance family's story. He saw their case not as a simple land dispute, but as a battle between good and evil. The first days of the trial were a blur of legal maneuvers and courtroom drama. Croft's lawyers, slick and confident, presented their case with a theatrical flair. They painted a picture of the Vance family as opportunistic claim jumpers, a family that had used a flimsy, hand-drawn map to steal a fortune. They brought in a parade of paid witnesses, men who swore they had seen Thomas Vance near the mine years before, but that he had never claimed it, thus making the claim invalid. The Vance family sat together, a silent show of unity. Caleb, Ethan, and Jonas, their faces grim, listened to the lies being spun about their father. Eleanor, her chin held high, watched as her family's honor was dragged through the mud. It was a different kind of pain from the one Jasper Thorn had inflicted. This was a slow, calculated destruction of their reputation. Jem Stone, however, was a man of patience and an unshakable belief in the truth. He didn't resort to theatrics. He methodically dismantled the opposing arguments using logic and a deep understanding of the law. He called Mr. Patterson to the stand, who testified to the Vance family's honesty and their commitment to registering the claim properly. He also called Eleanor to the stand. Eleanor, her voice clear and strong, told the story of her family's struggle, of being cast out by Jasper Thorne, of living in the barn, and of the years of hard work that had built their homestead and eventually the town of Haven. She spoke of the honor and integrity her husband had instilled in their sons, and of the trust he had placed in Old Man Bear. She didn't have to lie. Her truth was more powerful than any lie Croft's lawyers could invent. Croft's lawyers, unprepared for the raw emotion of her testimony, tried to discredit her. They questioned her memory, her sanity, and her motives. But Eleanor stood firm, her gaze unwavering, her story a testament to the unyielding spirit of a mother fighting for her family. The turning point came when Jem Stone called a surprise witness, Jasper Thorne. Thorne, a ghost of his former self, was brought in from his ranch. He was a disheveled figure, a man who had lost everything. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Thorne, his voice a raspy whisper, confessed to his greed, to the betrayal of Thomas Vance's trust, and to his attempt to steal the mine. He testified that the Vance family's claim was a valid one, and that their honor was unimpeachable. He had come to the courtroom not out of spite, but out of a desperate need for redemption. The courtroom was silent. Croft's lawyers, their faces a mix of disbelief and shock, had nothing to say. Their carefully constructed web of lies had been torn apart, not by a legal maneuver, but by a man's confession. A man who had once been the villain of the story was now a witness to the truth. The verdict, when it came, was a resounding victory for the Vance family. The judge, a stoic man who had seen it all, ruled in their favor, stating that the Vance claim was valid and that their honor was beyond reproach. Silas Croft, a man who had never lost a case, was defeated not by a legal argument, but by the power of a true human story. The brothers, exhausted but relieved, shook Jem's hand, their gratitude immense. They had won. Not just the mine, but their reputation, their honor, and the future of Haven. They had faced a new kind of enemy, and they had won with the same principles that had gotten them through the last 15 years. Honesty, integrity, and the unshakable bond of family. The victory in court was more than just a legal win. It was a communal celebration. The town of Haven, which had been holding its breath for weeks, erupted in cheers when the news arrived. The people had seen their own struggles mirrored in the Vance family's fight, and their victory was a victory for them all. The street was filled with people, a spontaneous parade of gratitude and joy. The Vance family, however, did not celebrate. They were humbled by the town's reaction, but they were also exhausted. The battle against Croft had taken a heavy toll, both emotionally and mentally. They retreated to their homestead, where Eleanor cooked a simple but comforting meal. They sat together, a quiet sense of peace settling over them. Later that evening, the town's mayor, a kind, stout man named Henry Larson, came to their door. He was accompanied by a delegation of townspeople, their faces a mix of respect and reverence. Henry spoke for them all, his voice filled with emotion. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice thick, "and boys, this town, we owe you everything. You didn't just build a place to live, you built a home for us. You built a community on a foundation of honor and trust. You showed us that good can triumph over evil and that a man's word is his bond." He then presented Eleanor with a small, beautifully carved wooden plaque. On it, in elegant lettering, were the words, "Haven, built on the honor of the Vance family." Eleanor, her eyes welling up with tears, accepted the plaque, her hands trembling. It was a simple gift, but it meant more to her than all the gold in the world. It was a testament to the life she had built, to the lessons she had taught her sons, and to the legacy they had created. The celebration continued for days. The town held a barbecue, with everyone contributing food and music. The mood was festive, but there was a deeper sense of unity that permeated the air. The trial had forced the town to confront its own values, and in doing so, it had solidified its identity. It was a town of good people, built on a foundation of integrity. The Vance brothers, as a sign of their gratitude, announced that a portion of the mine's profits would be set aside in a community fund. The fund would be used to help new families settle in Haven, to build a library, and to support the school. It was their way of giving back to the community that had stood by them. The years that followed were a testament to their vision. Haven grew, but it never lost its small-town feel. It was a place where doors were left unlocked, where a neighbor was always there to lend a hand, and where a man's word was his bond. The Vance name was synonymous with honor, a name that was respected and revered. Caleb married a woman from a neighboring ranch, a quiet, strong-willed woman named Sarah, and together they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He taught them the values his mother had taught him: integrity, hard work, and a deep respect for the land. Ethan married Clara, a woman who ran the town's general store with a fiery spirit and a kind heart. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and he taught them the silent wisdom of the land and the quiet strength of a man who loved his family above all else. Jonas married Lillian, a teacher from the East Coast who had been drawn to Haven by the stories she had heard. They had a single daughter, and he taught her the power of a sharp mind and the importance of using one's intellect for the greater good. Eleanor, in her later years, found a quiet happiness. She had her children and her grandchildren, a town that revered her, and a peace that had been so long in coming. She would often sit on the porch of her home, watching the sun set over the valley, a quiet smile on her face. The barn, their old home, was now a museum, a place where children could learn the story of a mother who had raised 3 boys in a barn and the men they had become. Years turned into a generation. Haven was no longer a new town. It was a well-established community, a respected dot on the map of the American West. The Vance brothers, now in their 50s, were graying, their faces a landscape of a life well lived. Their children were grown, and their grandchildren were running around the streets of Haven, a testament to the legacy they had built. One summer evening, a group of strangers rode into town. They were not dressed like prospectors or ranchers. They were dressed in fine city clothes, their faces pale and their hands soft. They were Frederick Vance, the youngest brother of Thomas, and his family. They had been living in New York, a life of comfort and refinement, and they had heard the stories of their kin in the West. The reunion was a somber one. Frederick, a well-meaning but naive man, was shocked by the story of his brother's death and the years of hardship his family had endured. He was also shocked by the Vances' success. He saw their town, their wealth and their reputation, and he saw a story he had never imagined. "But why didn't you just write to us?" Frederick asked, his voice filled with a genuine confusion. "We could have helped. We would have sent money. We would have fought for you." Caleb, his face a mixture of patience and weariness, explained, "We didn't know you existed. We were on our own. And even if we had known, we didn't want help. We wanted to do it ourselves. We wanted to build something of our own, something that was ours and ours alone." Frederick couldn't understand. He saw a missed opportunity, a life of unnecessary struggle. He saw a family that had suffered when they didn't have to. He was a man of the city, where problems were solved with money and connections. He could not comprehend a life where a man's worth was measured by his honor, not his bank account. His son, Henry, was even more detached. He was a cynical, opportunistic young man who saw the Vance story not as a testament to honor, but as a business opportunity. He saw the gold mine and the thriving town, and he saw a chance to make a quick profit. He began to question the Vance family's claim, not in a legal sense, but in a personal one. He questioned their methods, their decisions, and their commitment to a life he saw as primitive and backwards. The presence of the New York family was a disruption to the peace of Haven. Their questions, their judgment, and their sense of entitlement were a stark contrast to the values of the town. The people of Haven, who had known the Vance family for years, looked on with a quiet sense of protectiveness. They saw the Vances not as rich benefactors, but as family, and they did not like the way the New York Vances were treating them. Eleanor, with her quiet wisdom, saw the truth of the matter. She saw a family that was lost, disconnected from the very values that had made their own family so strong. She saw a man who had never had to struggle for anything, and a boy who only saw the world in terms of profit and loss. She knew that she couldn't change them, but she could protect her family from their influence. The visit culminated in a final confrontation between Henry and Caleb. Henry, with a sneer on his face, accused Caleb of being a simple country bumpkin who had stumbled into a fortune. He told him that he and his father would have done things differently, more efficiently, and with far more profit. Caleb, his voice low and dangerous, looked at the young man with a quiet intensity. "We could have done it differently, Henry," he said. "We could have bought the land. We could have cheated and lied. We could have become just like Jasper Thorne, but we didn't. We built something with honor. We built a town. We built a family. And you, with all your money and all your connections, you have nothing but an empty heart. You have nothing to show for your life but a number in a bank account. You have no one. We have a town." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. He saw the truth in the faces of the townspeople, in the quiet respect they showed for the Vance family. He saw the honor in Caleb's eyes, and he knew he had lost. He and his family left Haven the next day, a sense of shame and defeat in their wake. They had come to see a gold mine, but they had found something more valuable, a family that had found their worth not in a bank account, but in a life of honor and integrity. The final years of Eleanor's life were a peaceful and quiet time. She was a woman who had seen it all, a life of hardship, a struggle for survival, and the sweet taste of victory. She had raised 3 boys into men, and she had built a community that was a testament to her unyielding spirit. She lived to see her grandchildren grow up, to see Haven become a thriving city, and to see her sons become respected leaders of the territory. One evening, as she sat on her porch, a quiet smile on her face, Caleb came and sat beside her. He was a man in his 60s now, his hair a mix of grey and white, his face a map of a life well lived. He was a mirror image of his father, but with a quiet strength that was all his own. "Ma," he said, his voice soft, "are you happy?" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, profound sense of peace. "More than I ever thought possible, son," she said, her voice a gentle whisper. "I have everything I've ever wanted, a family, a home, a legacy. It's all because of you, Ma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught us everything. You taught us how to be men." "No," she said, her hand resting on his arm. "I just gave you a home. You found your own way. You made your own legacy. You did it with honor and integrity. I just pointed you in the right direction." She passed away peacefully in her sleep, a quiet, dignified end to a life of quiet dignity. The town of Haven mourned her passing. She was buried in a small, quiet cemetery on a hill overlooking the town she had helped to build. Her gravestone was a simple, elegant piece of stone, with a single word carved on it: Eleanor, matriarch. The Vance brothers, now men in their later years, carried on her legacy. They continued to lead the town with the same principles of honesty and integrity that she had taught them. They were not just the leaders of Haven, they were its soul. Old Man Bear, in his final years, passed away peacefully in his sleep a few months after Eleanor. He was buried in a small plot near the Vance homestead, a place he had helped to build. His gravestone, a simple piece of stone, was a testament to his role in their lives. Old Man Bear, a friend, a mentor, a guardian. The final years of the Vance brothers' lives were a quiet, dignified end to a life of quiet dignity. They had seen it all, the hardship, the struggle, the victory. They had faced their demons, and they had won, not with violence, but with a quiet, unyielding sense of honor. Caleb, the eldest, passed away peacefully in his sleep a few years after his mother. He was buried beside her, a testament to his role as her protector and the leader of his family. Ethan passed away a few years after Caleb. He was buried beside him, his quiet strength a comforting presence, even in death. And Jonas, the youngest, passed away in his sleep, a few years after his brothers. He was buried beside them, the strategist and the problem solver who had helped them to build their future. The three brothers, who had once been little more than a mother's dream, were now a legend. They were the men who had been raised in a barn, only to become the builders of a city. The story of the Vance family was a testament to the idea that a man's character was not defined by his wealth, but by his honor. The town of Haven, a testament to the Vance family's honor and integrity, continued to grow and thrive. It was no longer a small western town. It was a city with wide streets, elegant buildings, and a thriving economy. But it never forgot its roots. The Vance homestead, once a humble barn, was now a historical monument, a place where people could come and learn the story of the family that had built the town. The Vance legacy was not just in the buildings they had built or the wealth they had accumulated. It was in the values they had instilled in the town. It was in the quiet dignity of its people, in the respect they showed for each other, and in their unshakable belief that a man's word was his bond. The story was passed down from generation to generation, a legend that was more than just a tale of adventure. It was a story of a mother's love, of a family's resilience, and of a man's honor. It was a story that reminded people that a man's character was not defined by his circumstances, but by his choices. The ranch of Jasper Thorne, a forgotten ruin, stood as a cautionary tale. It was a symbol of a man who had chosen greed over honor, and who had lost everything in the process. It was a stark contrast to the thriving city of Haven, a city that had been built on a foundation of integrity. The Vance family, in their final days, had found a peace that had been so long in coming. They had not just survived, they had thrived. They had not just built a town, they had built a legacy. They had shown the world that even in the most unforgiving of circumstances, a man could rise above his demons and build a life of honor and integrity. The story of the rancher who scorned the woman who raised three in a barn was a story for the ages. It was a story of a family that had been broken but not defeated, a family that had lost everything but had gained something more valuable, a legacy of honor. And in the final years of their lives, they had found a peace that came not from their wealth, but from the simple truth that they had lived a life of integrity and that they had done so with honor.